Hey friends, welcome back to my channel. This is Cruel Intentions, a true crime channel. I am Holly, and with every video I take you on a journey throughout Australian true crime history. If you're interested in Australian true crime and, like me, cannot believe it's the middle of November already, then consider subscribing. Or don't. I'm not here to tell you what to do, I'm not your real mum, and I never will be. Today we're talking about the Wales-King Society murders. On the 8th of April 2002, 39-year-old Emma Connel walked into the Melbourne police station in Victoria, and she reported that her mother and stepfather had not been in contact with anyone for 3 days. They hadn't answered or returned calls, they hadn't shown up for breakfast or lunch reservations, they hadn't answered their intercom or their door, they'd missed medical appointments. No one had been able to contact them, and they hadn't reached out to anyone. Margaret Wales-King and Paul King were missing. 2 days after that report was made, Paul and Margaret's silver Mercedes-Benz was found in a suburb 20 minutes away from where they lived, and it had no reason to be there. 3 weeks later, park rangers John Gwilt and Alan Caddy noticed freshly turned dirt on track 3 of the Yarra State Forest. As they started raking off the dirt on top, they found Besser bricks connected with chains and D-shackles. Underneath those was a blue inflatable wading pool. Gwilt and Caddy thought someone might have used the national park to dump rubbish, and they began pulling at the plastic pool. As they pulled at it, something ripped inside the large hole, and they could see that it wasn't rubbish. Someone had buried bodies. The bodies would later be identified as Margaret Wales-King and Paul King. The affluent, wealthy couple had been assaulted with a heavy object causing trauma to the neck and face. Paul King suffered breakages in his nose and the middle of his face, but these blunt force injuries might not have killed him. There were also signs of asphyxia. Margaret Wales-King had suffered a fractured nose and also had heavy trauma to the neck and upper arm. There was also bruising around her neck which suggested strangulation. Again, though, this would not have been enough to kill her. Her brain tissue revealed hypoxia, and her cause of death was listed as suffocation or asphyxia. Margaret and Paul were well known and well liked in the community. They were considered high society, they had wealth and high social status. But they weren't out at fundraisers and events or trying to get themselves in the social pages of any newspapers. They were far happier focusing on their family. Margaret's 5 grown children from a previous marriage, all now married and with children of their own, and they had 11 grandchildren for them to spoil and watch grow up. The Melbourne press dubbed the murders the Wales-King Society murders, and while Margaret and Paul could have easily chosen to fit that title, they weren't concerned with celebrity or notoriety. They were protective of their wealth and assets, but they weren't the type to flaunt them to gain social status. They didn't seem to have any enemies and had plenty of friends. So the question was, how did the husband and wife come to be brutally assaulted, suffocated, and buried in a shallow grave on a dirt track? Margaret Wales-King was born Margaret Mary Lord on the 16th of June 1933. Her parents, Doreen and Robert Lord, went on to have another child, Diana Agnes, 6 years later. Robert Lord, known as Rob and later by his grandchildren as Pa Lord, made his fortune in road construction. His company became one of Victoria's largest road contractors. Because the Melbourne suburbs were undergoing rapid expansion at the time, he became a very wealthy man. Margaret and Diana grew up wanting for nothing. After attending some of the best private schools in the area, Margaret went on to business school. She never had a passion for business or the commercial world, though. She developed a love of the arts and preferred to paint and draw, and she also loved interior decoration. Margaret was tall, attractive, and intelligent, and was enjoying the social scene in her early 20s. In the mid to late 50s, she met a pilot named Brian Biggles Wales, and they married on her 24th birthday, the 17th of June 1957. When Margaret and Brian returned from their honeymoon, they moved into her parents' house in the affluent suburb of Camberwell, and her parents, Rob and Doreen, or Dottie Lord, moved into a neighbouring suburb. Only a year later, their first child, Sally Ann, was born, and in the next 10 years they would have 4 more children. Damien John, born March 1960, Emma Jane, born July 1963, Prudence Kate, born May 1965, and Matthew Robert, born in February 1968. The family of 7 enjoyed the finer things in life, splitting their time between their home in Camberwell, their beach house in Sorrento, or their winter holiday home at Mount Buller in the Victorian ski fields. The year Matthew was born, the Wales family took a holiday to Brampton Island in Queensland. While they were there, Brian and Margaret met a man who was also holidaying on the island. He was travelling alone and actually happened to live near the Wales family back in Melbourne. That man was Paul King. All 3 of them became good friends. Brian, who was a pilot for one of only 2 domestic airlines operating at the time, was frequently called away for long periods of time for work. Damien, the couple's eldest son, recalled that while his father was away, Paul King began to spend what he called an inappropriate amount of time at the house. Over the next 6 years, Margaret developed a sexual relationship with Paul King. Pa Lord found out about the affair and told Margaret that she was to stop seeing him or else she would lose her inheritance. In 1974, Margaret's father, Rob, died, so she could finally start to see Paul out in the open. Within days of her father's funeral, her husband Brian had moved out of the family home in Camberwell and had moved into the summer beach house. Paul King had moved straight in, and 2 years later, in 1976, Brian and Margaret Wales' divorce was finalised. The older Wales children, Sally 17, Damien 15, Emma 12, and Prudence 10, would often stay with Brian over the weekends and holidays. Matthew, who was only 7 when the divorce was official, was held back by his mother, who reportedly had told Brian on one occasion that Paul would be a better father for Matthew than he would. Brian remembers that he didn't have much to do with Matthew after the divorce, and he felt that this was mainly due to Margaret and Paul wanting it to seem like Matthew was their child. Paul King didn't have any biological children. He had lived most of his life relatively quietly. He was born Paul Aloysius King on October the 26th, 1927, and he would be the second of what would be 4 children. He had an older brother Stephen, a younger brother Peter, and a younger sister Mary. Until the early 1960s, Paul had worked in the wool industry in Sydney. He was employed by Coates Patten, a pattern and wool manufacturer, and he was able to move with them to Melbourne and earn a promotion to advertising manager. He was known as a very considerate, respectful, and dignified manager who was always well-dressed and well-spoken. He also owned an Angus cattle farm in a country town an hour and a half out of Melbourne called Kyneton. In 1968, he had decided to take a holiday to Brampton Island, and there he met Margaret Wales. He continued working for Coates Patten until 1977, after he had moved in with Margaret, and she convinced him to retire early at the age of 50 to help her by managing her bookkeeping and to raise cattle on the farm. When he left Coates, he was the state manager, and he was still well respected at his office. One of his colleagues described him as, quote, one of God's gentlemen. But one other thing was very well known about Paul King. He was a man absolutely devoted to his wife. The new family of 7 moved from Camberwell to nearby Kooyong, and they would travel to Paul's farm on the weekends. The younger 3 Wales children had benefited the most from their grandfather's inheritance. Prudence was able to keep 3 horses at the family farm. Matthew owned a number of dirt bikes. They had numerous overseas trips. They still had the beach house, the unit in the snow, several farms with different animals. The girls went to their mother's old school, Loretto Mandeville. Damien was sent to the private and exclusive Xavier College, and Matthew was sent to the Melbourne campus of the Caulfield Grammar School. Margaret's children remember the code names that they had come up with when Paul King had first moved in with them: the Butler and the Shadow. The oldest children, Sally and Damien, were old enough at the time to understand what was happening between their mother and Paul King, and so both of them believed that he was to blame for their parents' divorce. Damien remembered that when Paul King moved into their home only a very short time after their father had moved out, that they didn't really want him there. Emma said that Paul was just always there. She never really had a problem with him, but she said that they really didn't pay too much attention to him because their mother was the one that had to be obeyed. The older Wales children were allowed unlimited contact with their father, so she didn't really need Paul as a father figure, and mostly remembers Paul just being there to appease her mother, that Paul was, quote, at her beck and call. Prue, being the second youngest child, remembers Paul a little differently, thinking about how her and her brother Matthew had a much closer relationship with Paul than the older children did. She said that while she couldn't remember her stepfather having any friends, he was delightful and polite and always considerate. But all of the children recognised that Paul catered to Margaret's every whim. In Prue's words, quote, Paul was like a slave and he did everything for her. Mum would sometimes be the most shocking bitch to him, but he would just take it. Emma remembers her mother being carefree and spirited. She often painted and would hold painting parties with her friends, and the children would be allowed to join in. She was spontaneous and had what Emma described as, quote, an arty, laid-back, almost hippie, like really cool, calm and collected disposition. But Emma also remembers that throughout all of this there were certain rules that had to be followed. Margaret, at home as a wife and mother, was known as the one who must be obeyed. When Margaret was in her 40s, she was told by her doctor that she had developed breast cancer. She ended up having to have surgery on both breasts and having a reconstructive implant on one side of her chest. But she survived and lived the rest of her life in full remission. By 1995, all 5 of the Wales children had moved out of Margaret and Paul's home. They celebrated by eloping to Queensland and getting married in a private ceremony. Even Di, Margaret's sister, didn't find out about the wedding until Margaret and Paul were on their way home from Queensland. The newly married couple upgraded to a modern home at 40 Mercer Road in Armidale, where Margaret put her interior decorating skills to work, and she also tried her hand at art and antique collecting. They also kept a property in Red Hill South, a wine-growing region, and they would commute between the 2 residences regularly. The Wales children all remember their mother being very protective of the family's wealth. A number of the older children thought their mother exerted dominance over them by withholding financial support when they expressed desires to do things that she didn't want them to do. Prue said that it wasn't unusual for their mother to control situations with money. Things were either done her way or not at all. She also said that Margaret could be very unreasonable at times. 2 of Margaret's sons-in-law both expressed that they had seen firsthand the manipulation that Margaret could employ when it came to matters of money. One of them said, quote, I feel she can be really unfair and seems to love the self-importance of being in control. Emma remembers things a little differently though. She said that while her mother was overprotective of the family's wealth, she just saw that as Margaret being careful not to let her children squander it. When Emma's first marriage dissolved, Margaret stepped in to protect her investments and help her with all of the financial details. Margaret also used her substantial wealth to help each of her children purchase a home, financing a large portion personally and using bank loans for the remaining balances. 2 years before Paul King and Margaret Wales-King were found in a shallow grave, beaten and suffocated to death, Paul had collapsed while they had been visiting their Red Hill property. He was rushed to the nearest hospital and doctors diagnosed him with a heart condition and cerebral bleeding. He'd had a stroke. Repeated brain hemorrhages had actually worsened the condition. He was frail, he couldn't talk for too long, and he was also developing Alzheimer's, which made him forgetful and confused. Margaret found herself becoming more of a live-in nurse and carer than a well-taken-care-of, pampered lady of leisure. It was a difficult period of adjustment. Paul couldn't hold a conversation with her anymore. He couldn't leave the house by himself. He needed constant supervision. He would do things like turn the gas on and forget about it. Margaret needed to assist him with almost everything. She had stopped travelling too far, fearing that they wouldn't be close enough to a hospital and their doctor if Paul suddenly became worse or had another stroke. She had previously placed Paul in a nursing home just for a few days' respite, and when she came to get him, she had found him wandering the streets in his dressing gown, confused as to why he was there or how he got there. She had finally relented and had started looking into placing Paul into a Camberwell nursing home permanently so he could receive constant care and monitoring, which was taking a toll on her. The first few days of April 2002 were relatively normal for Paul and Margaret. They spent the days on walks, stopping for coffee on High Street, speaking to their neighbours, and phone calls with Margaret's daughters. She had spoken to Sally, Emma and Prue, each of them inviting Paul and Margaret to stay for the weekend, while all the girls and Matthew lived within a 5-kilometre radius of Margaret and Paul. The girls had all gone to separate holiday houses. Prudence in Portsea, Sally at the beach house in Sorrento, and Emma at the farm in Trentham. Damien had moved to Sydney some years earlier and lived there with his wife and children. Margaret told the girls that it was just too far for Paul to travel and they just couldn't risk going that far from Melbourne and Paul's doctors. Besides, she'd booked Paul into a daycare facility for the Monday and she desperately needed the break, so it would be better if they just stayed in Melbourne for the upcoming weekend. On Wednesday evening, the 3rd of April, Margaret and Paul went to their neighbour's home, the Van Hewerdens, for a meeting with some of the other residents of the row of townhouses on Mercer Road. There had been an issue with the wall that separated Margaret and Paul at number 40 and the Rose family at number 38. All the neighbours agreed that the best time for a plasterer to come in and have a look would be the upcoming Saturday, the 6th of April. Margaret was happy. She was very house-proud and liked getting things fixed as soon as possible. The next day, Thursday the 4th of April, Margaret and Paul spent the morning at home. The cleaner came and fixed up the house that didn't really need it. It was kept so clean and tidy as it was. Margaret's bookkeeper also paid them a visit. Margaret had a large share portfolio and liked to make sure that everything was in order. At lunchtime, Fred and Janet Roche arrived at the house. Janet was an old school friend of Margaret's and Fred's father had been business associates with Margaret's father. Fred and Janet and Margaret and Paul had the same accountant, they had the same lawyer, and Janet and Margaret had even joined a bridge club together. The Kings and the Roches were often visiting each other and had been for years. Fred dropped the ladies off for their bridge lesson and their lunch date. At 4:30 p.m, Fred picked the women up and the two couples shared some snacks and wine back at the Mercer Road address. Not long after they had sat down with wine in hand, Margaret's son Matthew had called just to let her know when dinner would be ready. Paul and Margaret were having dinner that night with Matthew, his wife Maritza, and their 1-year-old son Dominic. At 6:30 p.m, Margaret changed for dinner, a white top, grey slacks and a light cardigan that she wore around her shoulders. She freshened up her makeup, brushed her hair, and then turned on the bedside lamp. She turned down the covers on the bed and made sure it was ready to be used when they arrived home. Margaret was a very particular lady and liked things to be just right when she left the house. The Kings and Roches left their house together. Margaret and Paul got into their silver Mercedes and backed into the street. Janet and Fred had stayed so they could wave off the couple before heading home themselves. On Saturday the 6th of April, the plasterer arrived at the townhouses to inspect the wall between 38 and 40. The fault in the wall was on the King's side, and so he needed to access their townhouse. He rang the security buzzer at 8:30 a.m. and waited, but no one answered. He went over to number 42 to speak with John Van Hewerden, who put on a dressing gown and went back to number 40. He rang the buzzer again, but there was still no answer. He also noticed that the driveway lights had still not been turned off. He headed back home, confused. On Sunday the 7th of April, Emma received a call. She had heard the phone ringing when she'd come home that evening and ran to answer it. She was hoping that it was her mother. She had been worried ever since that morning. She hadn't heard from her mother in a few days, which was unusual on its own, but she'd grown even more concerned when her mother had not called or turned up for a breakfast date that they'd had. She and her husband James had spent the afternoon at the museum and the cinema, but the lack of contact from her ever-reliable mother had worried her all day. She had made James pull over on the way home so that she could try and call their house again. They'd both left their mobile phones at home. The answering machine picked up, which was again incredibly unusual. Emma's mother and stepfather would never usually be out on a Sunday night. When she got back to her house, she heard her phone ringing, and the answering machine had picked it up. She heard a female voice on the line and ran, hoping it was Margaret. But it wasn't. It was a lady named Sandra Ingpen, a friend of Margaret's, who told Emma that she had been trying to contact Margaret for 3 days. Emma rushed back to the car and drove straight to her mum's house. Nobody was home. The buzzer went unanswered and the house was empty and quiet. Starting to become increasingly anxious, Emma started driving down High Street, hoping that her mother, who was a big fan of routine and a creature of habit, had broken her usual Sunday routine and had gone out to a cafe for dinner. But she didn't see her mother or Paul anywhere. Emma returned home and rang both of her sisters before trying her mother again with no luck and settling down for a very restless night's sleep. The next morning, Monday the 8th of April, the Wales children were in panic mode. Emma's calls the evening before had stirred all of them. Sally called Emma back, but Emma had no updates. She also called and left a message for Matthew. They'd also called Prue. Matthew called Sally back, and after confirming that he had no idea where his mother and Paul could be, she told him that she was still at the beach house and would be going back as soon as possible, but asked if he would meet with Emma and go to the Mercer Road house to see if they had left any clues as to where they had gone. Matthew agreed, but after Sally had hung up, he realised that he had a few appointments that morning himself, so he called Emma to see if she could get Sally's husband Damien to go with her instead. He would be able to get the spare set of keys for the Mercer Road house from Sally, so it made sense. Emma and Damien Honan arrived at the house at 9:30 a.m. It was busy because the row of townhouses were located on the same street as a prestige private school, so there were a lot of cars on the street. As they arrived at the house, a taxi pulled up. Emma got excited, thinking that a taxi had been called from inside the house, but no one was outside waiting for it. She ran towards the vehicle and asked the driver who he was there for. He told her he was there for Paul King to take him to the Girraween daycare centre. Emma knew that her mother would never forget to cancel a taxi. Emma was in tears as she sent the taxi away, and her and Damien walked into the house. They searched through the entire house, and they noticed a few things that seemed really off. Margaret was always tidy and was religious about keeping the house clean. Emma and Damien saw that there were still dirty wine glasses on the kitchen bench, next to a bowl with pretzel crumbs. Margaret would never usually leave dishes out for too long, and they knew that she hadn't been there in at least a couple of days. Upstairs, the bed was turned back, the bedside lamp was on, Margaret's phone charger and glasses were there, and so was Paul's overnight bag, wallet, and driver's license. Emma didn't think that her mother and stepfather would leave these things at home unless they'd gone out the evening before, which again would have been highly unusual. As they continued through the house, they noticed that the phone's red light was blinking. The answering machine was almost full. There were 3 days' worth of messages that hadn't been checked. Calls from Sandra about a new puppy that they'd been looking at buying. From Damien Wales's wife Liz. From Matthew asking about his wife Maritz's new migraine medication. From Sally, Prue and Emma all checking to see if they could get in touch with their mother and Paul. The answering machine was enough for Emma to know that something was wrong, and she left the house and went straight to the police station. After she had reported them missing to the police, Emma went back to the house and picked up her mother's address book and diary. She called almost everyone in the book, but no one had seen the couple. All of Margaret and Paul's appointments and plans were in the diary. The word Portsea was written for Sunday, but it had been crossed out. She had obviously been thinking of visiting Sally, but had decided against being away from Paul's doctors. The entry that had said Matt's for dinner had a note next to it, one word written in Margaret's handwriting: cancelled. The details of the bridge lesson that she had attended with Janet Roche was also in there. Emma called Janet and found out that Janet and Fred had left on the evening of April the 4th and hadn't seen them since. Emma rang local hospitals, Paul's doctor's office, and even the man who had repaired the security buzzer a few days before, but no one had any answers for her. That afternoon, Emma went back down to the police station and sat down with officers to walk them through the list of people that they had called and all of the information that they had gathered, which, at this point, was minimal. Sergeants Cousins and McCrory spent almost an hour discussing scenarios, thinking of places that the couple could be and possible reasons for their absence. The couple being missing caused concern for the sergeants. Detective Senior Constable Craig Shiel came into the room. He had worked a few missing persons cases, but after hearing the situation at hand, he felt like this one sounded different. He wanted to go back to the house with the other officers to see if there was anything that they could find that might help them investigate. The officers' initial observations were that there did not seem to be any sign of forced entry or of a struggle, that the items the couple typically would have taken on any sort of overnight trip were still present at the house. The Wales girls caught up on anything new. Emma told Sally that Matthew had called her and asked her to take Damien to the house. Sally was pissed. She had asked Matthew to go because she knew that the clothing boutique that his wife ran was closed on Mondays. What could he possibly have to do that was more important than his missing mother? Fred and Janet Roche turned up at the house that evening because they had been worrying all day since speaking to Emma and Damien earlier. They gave the police a rundown of the Thursday afternoon that they had spent with the Kings. Emma, Sally and Damien had been calling the rest of the family and all of Margaret and Paul's friends all day, but it was the conversation they overheard with the Roches and the officers that really caught their attention. Janet Roche was telling one of the detectives that Margaret had said at about 6:45 that she was sorry, but she'd have to kick them out because she was expected at her daughter's house for dinner. All 3 of the Wales daughters had been out of Melbourne for the last week. Sally mentioned to Emma, as a last resort, that maybe Margaret had been talking about Matthew and Maritza. They thought this would be a long shot because the dinner plans in Margaret's diary had said that that event was cancelled, and because the 2 sisters had both spoken to Matthew just that morning and also left him a message the night before, telling him all about how his mother and stepfather had been missing, but he hadn't said a word about seeing them on Thursday night. Sally called Matthew's house and asked him if Margaret and Paul had come over for dinner on Thursday. He confirmed that they had. Sally told Matthew that he'd better get over to the Mercer Road house as soon as possible. The girls had been thinking that Janet and Fred Roche had been the last people to have seen the Kings, but in fact their own brother had actually been with them for hours afterwards. Matthew arrived at the house shortly after they'd spoken to him. He burst in through the front room and, according to Emma, quote, "His head looked like it was going to explode." She continued in a later statement saying that he arrived in an incredibly emotional state. He kept asking what was going on. He seemed surprised to see the police there and acted like he was fearing the worst. And then, very strangely, he walked over to the corner of the room, covered his face with his hands, and started moaning and crying out. He walked back to the group of siblings, hands on his hips, and said, quote, "Right, what's happening?" He seemed to be hyperventilating and was attempting to compose himself. He was obviously completely overwhelmed with the whole situation. Sally and Emma both thought that this behaviour was a complete overreaction to the current situation. No one had really spoken to him since he had arrived, and the last time they had spoken to him, Margaret and Paul just hadn't been seen for a couple of days. They could have been away for the weekend for all he knew. The police hadn't even had a chance to introduce themselves yet. Matthew had just run into the house and completely broken down. Emma, Sally and Damien had not been distraught or crying, had not alarmed him in any way. But his behaviour would only get stranger. Sally and Emma began to question him about what had happened at dinner on Thursday. They'd asked what they'd eaten, how their moods had been, how Paul was, what they'd been wearing, what conversations they'd had, when they'd left. Matthew was vague, and in between answering questions, he would put his head between his legs and would cry out things like, "Where's my mama? What happened to my mama?" Emma tried to keep him on track and kept questioning him, but he simply said that his mind was blank and that he, quote, "couldn't do this right now." Emma kept up the questioning, not giving in to her brother's emotions. He eventually recalled that his mother had been wearing a white shirt, a bolero jacket, tan trousers, and her usual jewellery, and that Paul had been wearing a blazer with gold buttons, a blue shirt, and jeans. Emma was concerned with the vagueness that Matthew seemed to be displaying, so she called his wife Maritza to check with her and see if she had any other information. But it seemed like Matthew's memory problems were catching. When Emma asked Maritza to confirm what Margaret had been wearing, Maritza told her she couldn't remember. Emma was surprised, seeing as Maritza ran a fashion boutique and it was one of her passions. Surely she would have remembered what her mother-in-law had been wearing only a few days beforehand. Maritza eventually told Emma that Margaret had worn, quote, "a white t-shirt sort of thing with a belt." Emma asked her what time Margaret and Paul had left their house after dinner. Maritza said that they'd seen them off at the front gate, but she couldn't remember what time it was. She then asked if Matthew was there. She told Emma to tell him to come home because she had a headache. Matthew couldn't leave yet though because he was now being questioned by Detective Shiel. He told the investigator that he and his wife had hosted his mother and stepfather for dinner and that they'd left at about 9:45 p.m. He'd walked them to their Mercedes, which was parked inside the garage, and he watched as they drove off. Shiel asked for Matthew's home phone number, and Matthew said that he couldn't remember it. He then broke down again, crying and shaking. He told the detectives he just couldn't do this right now, and he went home to look after his son while his wife slept off her headache. Emma, James, Sally and Damien all went over to their other sister Prue and her husband Angus's house. Prudence Reed lived in Toorak. She'd been worried all day but had had to take care of her 3 small boys while her husband Angus had been in Canberra for work. Angus had flown home early to be with his wife and her family, and had found most of her family sitting in their living room. Even Margaret's oldest son Damien had flown in from Sydney on the same flight as her sister Di. The only family that hadn't turned up were Matthew and Maritza, presumably because she was still dealing with her migraine and Matthew was looking after their 1-year-old son Dominic. The family unit, all huddled in the Reeds' living room, kept calling all of Margaret and Paul's friends. They ate takeout while they discussed where they could have gone or what could have happened to them. Damien called Matthew and Maritza multiple times throughout the evening to try to get them to come over. They needed the whole family, and they had been the last people to see Margaret and Paul. Maybe if Matthew had calmed down from his episode earlier in the day, Emma and Sally had explained to him Matthew's strange behaviour, his emotional outbursts, and his avoidance of their questions, then they might be able to get more information from him about what had been said that night, or if the Kings had been acting strangely, or if they'd said anything about going anywhere. But no one answered his calls, and neither Matthew or Maritza returned any of his multiple voicemails. Just before 11 p.m, Damien Wales walked into the backyard. After hearing his sister's rundown of Matthew's behaviour and the fact that he did not find it important to mention that he'd been the last one to see his mother and stepfather, had made Damien suspicious. He called the Melbourne police station and was put through to one of the detectives working on the missing persons case. He told them that he was at his sister's house with the rest of the family, but that Matthew had not turned up, and that he thought Matthew might have something to do with his mother and stepfather's disappearance, or at least that he knew more about it than he was saying. He asked if the police would be willing to conduct a welfare check on his brother just to make sure that he was okay, because no one could get in touch with him. Detectives Hodgson and Nolan arrived at Matthew and Maritza Wales' home just after 12 a.m. on Tuesday the 9th of April. They buzzed the intercom and waited. Matthew Wales eventually answered the door. His eyes were half closed. They had woken him, but he let them inside and they all went into the kitchen. Maritza came downstairs shortly after, also looking like she'd just gotten out of bed. The officers explained that Damien Wales had been trying to reach them all night and had not had any response from them, so they had been asked to come and check in. Matthew said that he had taken some codeine to try and get some sleep because he was, quote, a bit upset and concerned about my mother, you know. Detective Hodgson remembered thinking that he wasn't convinced and recorded in his notebook that Matthew Wales did not appear to be sincere when he said this, and that at no time did he ever mention Paul. Later that morning, Matthew finally joined the rest of his family at Prue's house. As soon as he arrived, he broke down in tears and cried out for his mother. Emma could not spare him any sympathy. She had her own suspicions and didn't have time to baby her younger brother while the rest of the family was actually trying to do something about the situation. Meanwhile, the police and detectives were working on a timeline. None of the neighbours or anyone in the area remembered seeing the Kings since the morning of the 4th of April, the day after the body corporate meeting. The King's gardener had come on schedule on Friday the 5th of April, but he had not seen his employers. He just went about his work. A description of the missing couple and their vehicle was given over police broadcast. It had also been sent, along with the missing persons report, to stations in Trentham and Sorrento, the suburbs that Emma, Sally and Prue's holiday homes were. And they were also sent to the Rosebud and Franklin hospitals, which were nearby to the holiday houses, to see if anyone matching the King's description had been admitted. While police officers were broadcasting the information on the missing couple, Detective Shield had been going over his notes. He had made a very quick phone call before he had gone to the Mercer Road house the day before, and the information he had requested had come back overnight. The call that he'd made was to the ANZ Bank, and the information that he had just received told him that Margaret Wales-King and Paul King had not touched a single cent in any of their accounts since Wednesday the 3rd of April. No credit card or debit card transactions, no cash withdrawals, no transfers, and not a single bill paid in 6 days. If they had travelled somewhere or had to go to hospital or taken a romantic getaway, they would have at least used some money. He knew from friends and family that he'd spoken to that Margaret and Paul weren't the type of people to carry cash, especially not enough for the two to have survived for almost a week without touching any of their accounts. None of their friends or families had seen them, let alone been asked for any money by them. Although they had only been reported missing the day before, the missing persons case was about to be upgraded. Detective Shield picked up the phone and dialed the number for the homicide squad. Homicide Squad detectives Sergeant Henry Van Veenendaal and Senior Constable Narelle Fraser arrived at the Melbourne Criminal Investigation Unit at about 9 a.m. that morning. They were under the command of Detective Sergeant Steve Waddell and part of a unit of 6 detectives assigned to the Wales-King missing persons case, which was now being upgraded to the Wales-King suspected murder case. Shield filled them in on the case so far, and the homicide detectives began by circulating photos of the missing couple to every airport, every seaport, bus company, and major railway station in Australia. They started combing through the returning passenger lists for any sign of Margaret or Paul. There was one entry in Queensland for a P, King, and female. The manifest listed a phone number, and a Paul King of Townsville got a real shock when he got a call from a homicide detective. But he couldn't help the officers. He wasn't the person they were looking for. After the handover of information, the Wales brood arrived at the police station for a briefing. Damien, Emma, Sally, and Prue were keen to assist in any way possible. Not surprisingly, neither Matthew or Maritza were able to make it that day. The homicide detectives began to question the Wales family on anything and everything that they knew about their mother and stepfather. While it was apparent that they knew a lot about their habits, personal preferences, travel plans, and daily routine, it seemed clear to the detectives that the Wales children had very little knowledge of their mother's financial position. The detectives went back to the Mercer Road address along with the members of the family that had come to the station. They also had crime scene unit officers meet them there to inspect the premises for anything that might help them. Crime scene investigators noted all of the strange things in the house, the glasses and food scraps, the fact that all of the Wales-King overnight items had been left at the home, the bed being turned down but not slept in, the bedside lamp still being on. There were no signs at all of violence in the home, and if something had happened to the couple, then it had happened somewhere else. Waddell spoke to the Wales children, telling them that there was no signs of forced entry or violence or robbery to be found. Just before 11:30 a.m., the Mercer Road house had a surprise visitor. Matthew Wales walked in the door. He handed Waddell a handwritten note outlining the details of the conversation he'd had with his mother and stepfather at dinner on the night of the 4th of April. She had spoken about Damien, Sally, Prue, and Emma. They'd talked about her garden and the new care centre that Paul would be going to. Margaret had told Matthew she wanted to take Dominic on a trip to see his cousins sometime. She'd also spoken about how she wanted him to use his American Express card for business expenses for Maritza's store so they could claim rewards points. Nothing in the note was helpful to Waddell. Around midday, Van Veenendaal and Fraser began a door knock of the neighbours' houses, and Shield walked down to High Street. Matthew's wife Maritza had set up a business in the high-end part of town. There were no grocery stores or convenience shops, but businesses like Bespoke Jewelers, an antique centre, and Maritza's Imports, specialising in European designer women's clothing. The sizes were small and the price tags were high. The store had not turned out to be the success that Matthew and Maritza Wales had hoped. While Maritza had worked in retail before, this was the first business that she had owned and run. It was currently almost $60,000 in debt, and just a few weeks before they had actually put the store on the market in hopes of selling it and opening something more suitable for both of them, like a cafe. Because of the lack of customers, when Shield went in to speak to Maritza, she had plenty of time to chat. She ended up giving a 5-page statement. She said that at dinner on Thursday, her, Matthew, Margaret and Paul had eaten a vegetable risotto and had gone through 2 bottles of wine. Her in-laws had played with Dominic, they'd gone through some wedding photos, and then they'd finished with some chamomile tea, and then Maritza had said goodbye, while Matthew had walked them to their car at about 9:45 p.m. She thought that they'd driven home after that, and neither Matthew or Maritza had left their house for the rest of the night. Maritza included a bit of family history in her statement. She said that the Wales family had always had their ups and downs, but mostly everyone got along just fine. She and Matthew had always gotten along with his brother and sisters and their partners, but she said that Margaret was a little standoffish sometimes, a bit snobby. She didn't know of any issues that the couple had with anyone, and she didn't think that they'd ever fought with anyone. Sheil asked about hers and Matthew's financial situation, but Maritza told him that they'd never really had any money issues. They didn't owe any money apart from bills, they'd never had any problems with gambling or any other debts. At the time that Sheil was talking to Maritza, Matthew had been asked by Waddell to come to the station and give a proper statement. His account of the evening he'd last seen his parents was very similar to his wife's. They'd had dinner, played with Dominic, talked about arbitrary things, and then he'd seen his mother and stepfather off. He said, quote, "When they left, Mum drove, and although they didn't say where they were going, I assumed they were going home. They reversed out of my driveway and drove off towards Wattletree Road. I did not hear from either Mum or Paul again that night, and I have not seen either of them since that time." He told the detective that their disappearance was totally out of character. He wasn't aware of any problems they had, and the last time he'd seen them, they seemed like their normal selves. By the end of the day, the police had also taken statements from Emma and Damien. They had door-knocked for hours and made hundreds of phone calls. They still didn't have any idea what had happened to Margaret and Paul or their car. They decided the only thing left to do was to get the media involved. The Wales family was asked to give a press conference the following day. They didn't know at the time that releasing a statement to the media would make this case one of the most publicised homicide operations in Australia. The Victorian Police Media Unit would end up receiving so many calls about the case that they would eventually refuse to speak about it at all. But at the time it seemed like a good idea. Damien, Prudence and Emma attended as the family representatives. Matthew had said that the media was, quote, "not his thing." The missing wealthy couple was an instant headline for papers across the country, mainly because there seemed to be absolutely no reason that this wealthy, social, opulent couple would have voluntarily left their large, beautiful home, loving family, and affluent lifestyle. Watching that media conference was a man named Mark Hester, a solicitor who lived in Middle Park, about 20 minutes away from the King's townhouse. A few minutes into the press conference, Mark Hester called the police. A few days earlier, as he'd been walking his dog, he had noticed a sleek silver Mercedes-Benz E320 sedan parked near his street. He'd seen the vehicle for 5 days straight, just sitting outside a property that was being renovated. It was basically just a shell of a house. He'd noticed the disabled sticker on the front window and thought it was an unusual place for a disabled person to park. Surely they would have parked closer to wherever they were staying or visiting. When he'd seen the media conference, he heard the details about the King's missing vehicle, and he ran outside to check the license plate of the Mercedes outside the building site. It was the same plate as the one they had described in the news story, so he called the police straight away. The officers quickly set up crime scene tape and had detectives and crime scene units called in. They called the Wales sisters and asked if they would be able to provide the spare key for the vehicle and if they could bring it down to Middle Park, but asked that only 2 family members come because they didn't want too many people there. Sally decided that her brother Damien and Emma's husband James should go. She was worried that her mother and stepfather's bodies would be found in the boot, and didn't think that any of the sisters would be up to seeing anything like that. As Damien and James were heading to Middle Park, Sally, Prue and Emma were on their way to Matthew and Maritza's house. They told him that they all needed to go and stay at Emma's until the police called because they had found the car. Matthew was full of excuses. He wasn't feeling well. Maritza didn't want him to go anywhere. She didn't want to look after Dominic alone. But that's when Sally lost her temper with him. She told him that it was important that they be together because it might turn out that their mother and Paul had been found. This was the biggest break in the case so far, and he was acting like it was an inconvenience. Matthew finally agreed and got in the back of Emma's car. He began to cry and hyperventilate again. His sisters tried to calm him down on the way, and they all arrived back at Emma's home, hoping to get an update, but not sure if they wanted one. Paul King's older brother, Stephen, had also flown down from Sydney, and he had joined the family at Emma's home. They all prayed together and held a silent vigil of their own in the living room. Sally's mobile had rung, and everyone was scared, but it was Damien on the other end of the line letting the family know that the car boot had been empty. There was still no sign of their mother or Paul. While they were all relieved that the couple's bodies hadn't been found in the boot of their car, it gave them no more information on where they could have gone or what could have happened to them. Anything found in the car was sent to forensic labs, including plant buds, leaves, pebbles, some hairs, unknown fibres, and a small amount of a blood-like substance that was found on the rear seat. Police were also talking to anyone who lived nearby where the car was found. Charles Matricide, who lived nearby and worked as a night shift driver, said he'd seen the vehicle parked in the street. He'd first noticed it when he'd left for work at 2 a.m. on Friday the 5th of April. He was absolutely certain about the date because it had been his first shift back at work after a back injury had caused him to take 3 months off. So between leaving Matthew's house at 10 p.m. and 2 a.m. the following morning, the Wales-King car had been parked in Middle Park, and the couple had just disappeared. The detectives needed more information about what might have happened to them. On the 11th of April, investigators arrived on Matthew and Maritz's doorstep. They weren't home, but detectives waited, and eventually Matthew pulled up in his red Nissan Patrol. They told Matthew that they needed to ask some questions and take a look around. Matthew told the detectives that he understood and he was happy to help because he'd been the last one to see them. He answered all of the questions asked of him. He didn't know what had happened to his mother or Paul. He didn't know where they'd gone after leaving his house. He had no idea why they would have been in Middle Park, and yes, they seemed fine when they left. He confirmed what they'd eaten for dinner, the conversations that they'd had, and when Detective Van Veenendaal asked if he'd gotten along with his stepfather, Matthew replied that he, quote, got on the best with Paul out of all of the family, and that he'd really liked the man. Investigators then had a look through Matthew's house. When they got to his garage, they both noticed a very strong chemical smell either coming from Matthew's car or the garage itself. They couldn't locate the source of it, but they both noted it in their reports. They thanked Matthew for his cooperation and left to go door knocking at the neighbours' houses to see if anyone had seen or heard anything that might help point them in the direction that Margaret and Paul had gone that night. One of the neighbours mentioned that the weekend that Margaret and Paul had gone missing, they had happened to look out of their window and see that Matthew Wales had removed every single thing from his garage onto his lawn and had hosed it out with a high-pressure hose. They had never seen him do anything like that before, but after seeing his house on the news, they thought it might be of interest. And it was. It might have explained the chemical smell, and was it simply coincidence that Matthew had chosen that weekend to deep clean his garage? Or was there a different, more sinister reason? The following day, officers returned to Matthew and Maritz's house and asked if they consented to allowing police to take Matthew's vehicle for forensic testing. Matthew agreed, and the vehicle was taken. Nothing of much interest was found. There were the usual items kept in a vehicle: spare tire and tools, sunglasses, a street directory with a bookmark in it, but nothing that would indicate that Margaret and Paul had ever been in that vehicle. They also asked permission to test the garage floor. Again, Matthew and Maritza agreed and watched as officers taped up the windows and any cracks where light could come in and began spraying a mixture of luminol, hydrogen peroxide and water all over the garage floor. The compound reacts with iron in the hemoglobin of the blood and makes it glow. It can indicate the presence of blood for up to 10 years and can also reveal blood evidence even after many cleaning attempts. After spraying the floor, there were 5 small spots that glowed electric blue in the dark. There was blood on the floor. A very small amount, 5 drops. It might not be enough to get a profile, but they could take it for evidence. Over the next 2 weeks, homicide detectives and police trawled through lists of potential suspects, theories, and notes. Meanwhile, the Wales children walked the streets around Middle Park every single day to try and see anything or speak to anyone that might be able to help them. All of the children except, surprise, Matthew. While the detectives' focus was still on Margaret's youngest son being the last person to have seen them and being suspected by his siblings, they still needed to spend hours upon hours checking all possible suspects, financial positions, relationships, and movements of anyone who knew the couple. Prue's husband, Angus John Luxmore Reid, was also on that list. He had been in Melbourne by himself on the weekend that Margaret and Paul had gone missing. Prue and their 3 sons had been in Portsea at the beach house that weekend. Police questioned Angus and he told them how he really felt about his mother-in-law. He said that Margaret had tried to manipulate her children with money, whether giving it or withholding it. He also said that really he just tolerated her and that he was pretty indifferent to her. He told them that he'd been working in the city the day that Margaret and Paul had gone for dinner at Matthew's house. After work, he'd caught a taxi to Romeo's restaurant in Toorak, where he'd had dinner alone, but he couldn't recall what he'd done from about 10 p.m. onwards. He thought he'd just gone home and watched TV, but he couldn't recall any programs that he had been watching. A couple of days later, however, he told police that he'd been confused about the dates, and he had actually gone to Royal City Spa for a steam bath and massage after work. He'd then stopped back at his office to pick up some papers before heading to Romeo's for dinner. He'd arrived home at about 11:30 p.m., well after the last time Margaret and Paul had been seen. His credit card statements supported that series of events. He was crossed off the suspect list, having been able to provide an alibi. Police began checking traffic cameras to see if the Mercedes had been seen anywhere between Margaret and Paul leaving Matthew's house and appearing in Middle Park, and any time within the week after, just in case it had been moved from Middle Park at any time. It hadn't come up on any of the cameras in any of the local towns. Detectives also made inquiries at Matthew's old workplace, a salon in a nearby shopping centre where he worked as a hairstylist. He had subleased part of the salon to run his business, but the owner said that he'd never had any trouble with Matthew and he'd found him to be a good tenant, always paying rent on time, and he treated his staff well. The owner, Tony Lattouf, also told police that Matthew's business was a success, and it only got better after his marriage to Maritza. Lattouf had the impression that Matthew had a lot of respect for his mother and that he wasn't boastful about their wealth. It had been unfortunate that due to RSI, or repetitive strain injury in his hand, that Matthew had had to stop working and become a stay-at-home dad to Dominic while Maritza went to work at her shop. More inquiries were launched with anyone who had any sort of regular contact with the Wales-King couple. Their bookkeeper, accountant, stockbroker, solicitor, gardener, their mechanic, their car detailer, the antique furniture store person, Margaret's hairdresser, Paul's care centre employees, and more, but no one could shed any light on the disappearance. While the police were making their inquiries, most of the Wales children were doing their own, and their father had joined them. Brian Wales had flown to Melbourne from England to be with his children and help them through what was happening. On the 26th of April, Brian Wales went to his youngest son's house for dinner. Matthew cooked and served dinner, but Brian noticed that throughout the night, Matthew and Maritza made absolutely no mention of Margaret and Paul's disappearance. Brian thought it was strange that he'd flown all the way from England because his ex-wife and her husband were missing to comfort his children in what must be a scary and worrying time for them, and although his other children were worried sick, Matthew and Maritza just didn't seem to be bothered and never spoke about it. Before he left, Brian asked if he'd actually seen Margaret and Paul drive away, and he was assured that Matthew had watched them back out of the garage and drive down the street. Matthew dropped his father back at Sally's house where he'd organised to stay and went home. Sally was glad to see her father. After all, the last time one of her parents went to her youngest brother's house for dinner, they'd never been seen again. The Wales children were still going out every day to search for any trace of their missing family members, everyone except Matthew and Maritza, and their lack of involvement was being noticed by not only the family but by police and some of the public as well. They had not had anything to contribute at family meetings, no theories, and would hardly ever participate in the conversations surrounding what had happened. Matthew refused to do any media appearances or interviews and would not be present at family dinners, preferring to spend his time at home with his wife and son. Damien Wales and Prue Reid had spoken to the media again, this time begging for any information that would help them find their mother and stepfather. Their statement to the media was given on the 16th of April, the day before their father had arrived from England. Damien had said, quote, "Please just give us some sort of lead. Please come forward. I don't know why you have hurt our mother or taken her from us. We don't deserve it. We want to know what's happened." Prue's last words in the statement were, quote, "If we can't have them, we want their bodies." It was less than 2 weeks later, on the 29th of April, that they would get exactly that. Early on that Monday morning, John Gwilt had gone out to the Upper Yarra Dam in the Yarra State Forest. The State Forest was about 100 kilometres or 60 miles away from Armidale, about a 2-hour drive. Parks Victoria had decided to close a dirt track there known as Track 3. They were closing it to help protect the water supply contained in a nearby reservoir. Gwilt needed to arrange the closure of the track by getting a bobcat operator to come out and place large boulders over the track where it met the road. He had driven down Track 3 a few hundred metres and then turned down a small dirt track. He got out of his vehicle and sprayed some red crosses on some rocks to show the subcontractor where he needed to start digging. He walked up the track a short way to the point where Woods Point Road couldn't be seen and the few cars that came by could hardly be heard. He was looking for large boulders that he could point the bobcat operator to. He thought he might be able to make the contractor's life a bit easier by being able to point him in the right direction. He didn't find any boulders, but he did find a freshly turned mound of dirt. He thought at first it might have been a lyrebird's mound. The male lyrebird would create a mound of dirt as a stage for their mating dance, but after looking more closely he noticed that the dirt was compacted, and the birds weren't known for doing that. He also saw a couple of large rocks at the top of the dirt pile and green grass that would have looked more at home on a lawn than out on a dirt track. He thought maybe some deer hunters had made a campfire and then possibly buried it as they had left their camp. He saw a couple of small pieces of rope on the ground and he knew that hunters often brought dogs with them, so maybe the rope had been used to tie the dogs up. But he had a strange feeling about it. He looked at the measurements, and the thing that came to mind as he looked at the oblong-shaped mound about 2 meters long and about 1 meter wide was a grave. But, he thought to himself, he was being silly. There was no headstone, no marker or cross or anything. John Gwilt walked back to his car, still with a weird feeling, but hoping to shake it off by throwing himself into the maintenance jobs that he had for the day. As he worked, the mound of dirt kept playing on his mind. He went back to the Parks Victoria offices and told his colleague Alan Caddy about what he had found. Caddy agreed to go back out to the track with Gwilt to check it out. They started raking the dirt off the top, each trying to convince the other that it was anything but a grave. About 10 centimetres or 4 inches into the mound, Caddy's rake hit something hard. They kept raking until they could pull out the thing the rake had hit. It was a Besser brick. There were 2 more of them, all 3 connected together with a chain and a D-shackle. Under the bricks was a blue plastic, which they began to recognise as a small inflatable children's wading pool. It was at that point that the men assumed that someone had simply tried to avoid dump fees by burying their rubbish off the dirt track. Gwilt pulled the pool towards him, and while Caddy kept raking, the rake hit something soft, and they brushed away some soil. They saw a cotton bag with a bit of chain looped around one end. As Caddy used the rake to pull the cotton bag towards him, the cloth ripped. And that's when the smell hit them. It was a rotting, putrid smell, the smell of something dead and decaying. Caddy leant forward and saw a flash of white where the cloth had ripped. It was unmistakable. The men had found a human body. Gwilt and Caddy ran back to their car and called the office. They asked the ranger on duty, Miles Stewart Howie, to call the police, and they slowly walked back to make sure that they had seen what they thought they'd seen. They had. They walked back to the car, and Stewart Howie called them back to let them know that the police were on their way. Gwilt and Caddy drove back to Woods Point Road to wait for the officers. Senior Constable Wayne Phillips from the local Warburton police station was the first to arrive. He met Gwilt and Caddy at about 1:30 p.m. at the entrance to the dirt track and took their details. The 3 walked back to the hole, and Caddy lifted the inflatable pool out of the dirt. Phillips saw the bricks, the cloth, the chain, and the body. He also smelt the foul odour coming from the shallow grave. He immediately called the Lilydale Crime Investigation Unit, and within minutes he was joined by Detective Acting Sergeant Ross Hill and Senior Constable Bridget Cherico. In the hours following that discovery, the track would be crowded with Lilydale CIU officers, homicide squad detectives, police photographers, and forensic teams. One of the crime scene examiners, Senior Constable Peter Cox, collected a number of pieces of evidence at the scene, including cigarette butts, pieces of rope and twine, the children's wading pool, the Besser bricks and chain, the large rocks that had been placed on top of the grave, some of the dirt, and some insect eggs and larvae that had been found on the body. Some of these might point to whoever had dumped it there, and the insect eggs and larvae would be sent to forensic entomologists to try and determine how long the body had been there. Cox had also noticed marks on the side of the grave wall. The tool marks were clearly visible because of the layer of clay in the soil. There were some flecks of blue-green paint in the grooves made by whatever had been used to dig out the hole, so Cox collected samples and also made a plaster casting of the tool marks in the ground. A few hours after the body had initially been found, Detective Senior Sergeant Charlie Bezina of the Homicide Squad arrived and took over the scene. He decided that they had enough pictures and had collected enough forensics to finally remove the body from its grave. They would be able to examine the area better and more closely if the body were to be exhumed. It was lifted out of the hole, and it was only then that everyone at the scene realised there was another one. There wasn't just one person in the grave, there were 2. The second one had also been wrapped in cotton. The officers realised that the cotton wrappings were actually quilt covers. The second body had rope twisted around one end, and it lay the opposite way from the first. The police photographer made sure to capture photos of the second body before it too was lifted out of its grave. Both bodies were zipped into white bags and taken up the dirt track where the government undertaker's hearse was waiting. The following morning, Dr. Malcolm Dodd was woken at about 1 a.m. by his phone. He was informed that 2 bodies were on their way for autopsy. Dodd had worked as a forensic pathologist since 1995. He and his colleagues perform over 3,500 autopsies a year. A body is sent for autopsy in Victoria if the death is unexpected, sudden, or suspicious, and the bodies found in the shallow grave met all 3 points of criteria. Dodd cut away the quilt cover on the first body. Under the cover and the chains and rope, Dodd found that the head was also covered with several layers of green cloth. It had been held in place over the face with elasticized edges gathered and tied under the jaw. Dodd lifted the cloth to look into the decomposing face of an elderly man. He confirmed that the victim had suffered blunt trauma to the face and neck. There was bruising to the face, neck, forearm, and leg. There were 3 breaks in the nose and middle of the face. He also noted there were signs of manual neck compression. Dodd did not think that these injuries alone would have caused death, but it would have definitely rendered the male victim unconscious. He did say, though, that positional asphyxiation could not be ruled out. Death probably occurred from occlusion of the nasal and oral airways during deep unconsciousness. Basically, the man had been beaten and strangled until he was unconscious, and then his airway had been cut off, which had caused him to suffocate to death. The other body had also been wrapped in a quilt cover and also had the layers of green cloth covering the face. When they were removed, Dodd could see that he was dealing with another elderly victim, this time female. She had been in a better state of preservation than the male, as she had been underneath the male in the shallow grave. She also had bruising on the face, neck, and arms. She had a fractured nose, and there was evidence of strangulation. Once again, the autopsy revealed hypoxia. The victim had suffered lack of oxygen prior to death. The injuries found would have not been enough to kill her, but would have left her unconscious, and after that, she had suffocated. Both victims had died as a result of blunt force trauma and asphyxiation. Dodd found the same stomach contents in both victims. They had shared a vegetarian meal that had gone through only minimal digestion. They had both been killed shortly after eating. Toxicology results were also examined. Tests showed that both victims had normal levels of alcohol in their systems. The report also showed paracetamol and codeine, and in the female system they found a medication called atenolol, which is prescribed for high blood pressure. The victims could not be identified by their faces alone. The decomposition had been too great to be visually identified. Based on the clothing found on the bodies, a blazer, a collared shirt and jeans on the male, and a white singlet, grey slacks on the female, as well as jewellery found on both victims, the approximate age of the victims, and the fact that the female victim had 1 silicone implant, the result of reconstructive surgery, it wasn't difficult for detectives to figure out who they were looking at. The investigators and officers now needed to tell the Wales children that their mother and stepfather had been found. Dental records would later officially identify the bodies in the grave as Margaret Wales-King and Paul King. Detectives Waddell and Fraser went to Sally Honan's house to inform most of the family, while detectives Nazarition and Brundell were tasked with heading to Matthew and Maritz's house to break the news to them. When they arrived, they told Matthew that there had been a development. Matthew had taken a deep breath, his face had drained of colour, and he looked down, fidgeting with his hands under the table. The detectives told Matthew that the bodies had been found, and while formal identification had not yet occurred, everything found at the shallow grave pointed to them being the bodies of his mother and stepfather. The detectives wanted to let them know before they found out from the media. Nazarition noted that on hearing this information, quote, Matthew's complexion remained pale and he showed no obvious signs of emotion. The detective asked Matthew if he had any questions, and Matthew said no. Maritza then walked into the room and Matthew shared what he'd just heard. She sat motionless and hung her head. Matthew then promptly asked the officers to leave his house. Later that afternoon, Matthew and Maritza joined the rest of the Wales family at Sally's house. All afternoon they listened to the local radio broadcasts and watched the television news reports of the bodies that had been found in the Yarra State Forest. Emma Connel watched Matthew and Maritza during the airing of the news reports. She thought that Matthew was oddly emotionless and that his wife, her sister-in-law, seemed to become more and more angry as the reports kept coming in. Emma would tell police later that she had the impression that Matthew was in trouble with his wife because the bodies had been found. Detectives arrived back at Sally's house for the second time just before 8 p.m. He had to tell them that the bodies had been formally identified. They spent an hour with the family delivering the news, and it was the hardest hour of the Wales children's lives. But the detectives also had a second task that night. As the family meeting with the detectives wrapped up, Waddell pulled the youngest Wales child aside. The police had a warrant to search Matthew's home. By 10:30 p.m, police and forensic teams were all over Matthew and Maritz's Burke Street home. They took numerous photos and collected a number of things from the home and garage, including a post-hole shovel, a mattock, 3 silver D-shackles, a ball of twine, the dust bag from the vacuum, and a quilt cover that was suspiciously similar to the one that had been used to cover the body of Paul King. They'd actually had to remove that quilt cover from the bed, and when they checked the linen cupboard, there weren't any other queen-size ones. If the similar covers were a coincidence, it meant that Matthew and Maritza Wales only had one set of bedding. The media went crazy with the story. Besides being a murder mystery, Margaret Wales-King was set to leave her family her accumulated wealth, with investments, stock, house, and belongings worth around $6 million. The media had picked up on the fact that Matthew and Maritza's house had been searched and latched onto that, causing the public to cast suspicion on Matthew either being the killer himself or knowing who it was and covering for them. Maritza's role was more vague. The public went between her being the mastermind of the whole thing to not knowing anything about it. On the 3rd of May, Margaret's sister Di Yeldham and Damien Wales spoke to the press outside Matthew and Maritza's front gate. They told reporters that the family's grief at the death of Margaret and Paul was only being compounded by hurtful speculation about the killer or killers. Di continued by saying that the rumours surrounding the murders were unfounded. What they didn't say to the media surrounding the house is that they had gone there to try and question Matthew about the murders. Damien had already suspected his brother knew more about the night that the couple had disappeared, but this had grown into a conviction that his brother knew who had killed them, that he was covering for whoever had murdered Margaret and Paul. Their meeting didn't help though. Damien and Di learnt nothing new except what they'd already suspected, that Matthew and Maritza were living beyond their means. Damien's suspicions and the rest of the family's were only increased when on Sunday the 5th of May, Detective Steve Waddell came to Sally's house and asked that all of the Wales children provide a DNA sample. Each of them complied, except for one, and no prizes for guessing which one. Matthew told the detectives that he'd been advised by his lawyer not to provide a sample. The rest of the family hadn't even known that Matthew had spoken to a lawyer, let alone been told not to give his DNA. Emma asked Matthew why he refused to give a sample, and Matthew told her that he was simply protecting his family. Emma was shocked. "We are your family," she told him, and he said that he meant his direct family, his wife and son, and that he had to protect them. Emma asked him what he needed to protect them from, seeing as they were only trying to find the person or people who killed their mother. She wasn't even able to finish that sentence before Matthew lunged violently at her. Their father, Brian Wales, and aunt, Di Yeldham, had to restrain him while they told Emma to go outside. Brian Wales recalled later that seeing his son like that made him think that he was quite capable of killing someone. Once Matthew had calmed down, he went outside where Emma, Sally, Damien and Prue were all huddled together. He told them that he didn't expect them to understand his decision, but that his solicitor had said not to give his DNA because the police could use it to frame him for something, and he had to protect his son. He then broke down crying. On Tuesday the 7th of May, the family were told that the bodies were ready for viewing. A rosary service was held where the family members of the couple were invited to pray for their souls before a family mass the following day. Prior to the start of the rosary, the Wales sisters and their partners and Damien met in the foyer of the private chapel, where they were joined by members of the extended Wales-King and Lord families. The only people not there were Matthew and Maritza. Emma, Prue and Sally were worried that they wouldn't arrive in time for the service, but when they went through the doors to the chapel, they saw Matthew and his wife sitting quietly in the second row. The girls and Damien walked directly up to the altar and all placed their hands on their mother's coffin. They huddled together and cried for the loss of their matriarch. Emma was not the only one to notice that Matthew and Maritza were the only people in the entire chapel not crying, or at least showing some sort of emotion. But after a few minutes, Matthew slowly stood up and walked towards the bodies of his mother and stepfather. He grabbed hold of the sides of his mother's coffin and broke down. He sobbed, he cried out for her, he practically wailed, drowning out all other sounds from inside the small chapel. Damien Wales had to be restrained by his wife and sisters. He was angry. He knew Matthew knew something about how this had happened, and to see him putting on this overt display infuriated him. He was escorted back to his seat by his wife Liz and Emma, who whispered to him that they were there for their mother and Paul, not for Matthew. Emma would also later recall that during the service she saw Maritza cleaning her boots. She said, quote, "She seemed uninterested and I was very offended by this." When the rosary service had finished, the family once again gathered in the foyer to console each other, except for Matthew and Maritza, who quietly walked out of the funeral parlour with their heads down. The next day, the private funeral service was held for family only. Over 40 members of the Wales-King Lord families attended. Although they had tried to keep the location and service details secret, the church was swamped with reporters, all trying to get a good shot of the family, and in particular Matthew Wales. There had been more mention of him in the paper just that morning, and photographers, reporters and journalists were desperate to get pictures of the man under so much suspicion. On Thursday the 9th of May, a public memorial service was held for Margaret and Paul, and it became clear that the couple, or at least Margaret, had made an impression on many, many people. There were over 700 attendees and numerous reporters. Sally had reserved the front row of pews in the church for the Wales family. She sat down and noticed that Matthew and Maritza had chosen to sit away from the family a few rows back. She also noticed that Maritza's family had not chosen to attend. Damien Wales and Di Yeltham delivered the eulogies, and the rest of Margaret's children all delivered readings and prayers. Once the service had finished, the family moved to the front of the church and placed small white candles in the front of small boxes that contained Margaret and Paul's ashes. Emma was angry. Her younger brother had absolutely no input into the funeral, by his choice, whereas everybody else had tried to assist as much as possible. He hadn't even asked what had been planned or what was happening after the funeral. He hadn't asked about the wake or the arrangements for the family to get to the service. Maritza hadn't said a single word to any of them, either at the funeral or afterwards. Emma recalls approaching her before the service began, giving her a peck on the cheek and asking her how she was doing, and she got absolutely no reply. 2 days later, the family was able to bury the boxes of ashes in Sorrento. The beachside village held many memories for the Wales family. They had spent many summers in the family beach house, and both Sally and Prue had decided in adulthood to purchase their own holiday homes there. There were a couple of people missing from this burial, and if you've come this far in the case, then you know exactly who it was. It was Matthew and Maritza. They weren't there because at the same time that Margaret and Paul were being laid to rest, Matthew was being arrested on 2 counts of murder. What the Wales family didn't know was that detectives had been gathering some very interesting evidence and testimony in the week leading up to the funeral, starting with the items that had been taken from Matthew Wales's home on the 30th of April. The green twine found in the garage was an exact match to the twine found at the gravesite. The D shackles were identical to the one found connecting the chain and dresser bricks on Paul's body. The blood spots found with the luminol in the garage were human. Detective Andrew Stamper had been tasked with going through Matthew and Maritz's bank statements, which confirmed that not only were they in debt and a lot of it, but also a number of other purchases. On the 11th of January of that year, Matthew had spent over $100 at a toy store. When the store was contacted, it was revealed that he had purchased some plastic balls, some candy, an air pump, and one Cloverleaf Swim Center inflatable wading pool, the same brand and type as the one used to line Margaret and Paul's grave. And of course, during the search of Matthew's house, that pool was never found. Another purchase was being investigated at the same time. Detective Senior Constable Stuart Cameron of the Homicide Squad was interviewing a man named Scott Turley. Turley had worked for a couple of years at the mobile petrol station in East Melbourne, located on the same street as Matthew and Maritz's house. As well as offering fuel and convenience items, it also had a trailer hire service. He told Cameron that he had started work at 6 a.m. on the 5th of April and by 7:30 had hired out 2 trailers, the second of which had been paid for by credit card. The same customer had also bought 1 D-shackle. In order to hire the box trailer, the customer had to provide a driver's license and fill out their personal details on the hire form for the petrol station's record keeping. The hire form listed the customer as Mr. Matthew R. Wales and had the address listed as 6 Horace Street, Melbourne, which just happened to be Matthew Wales's previous address. The trailer was returned on Monday the 8th of April at 3 p.m. The trailer in question was taken to the Victorian Forensic Sciences Centre for testing. Cameron wasn't finished yet though. He had another couple of purchases to investigate. He spoke to Julie Hayes, the owner of Tate Timber and Hardware. At 8:45 a.m. on the 5th of April, a purchase was made there. The receipt confirmed that 5 D-shackles, 5 metres of sash cord, 6 metres of galvanised chain had been purchased. Another purchase made at Dean's Hardware on the 6th of April was confirmed as a matic and an industrial-strength cement cleaner called Liquid Magnet. The last purchase that was investigated was from Fulton's Garden Supplies on the 6th of April. A large amount of shawcrop compost was purchased to be delivered to the Burke Road house on Monday the 8th of April. As well as the items collected from Matthew's garage and his strange, suspicious and very coincidental purchases, there was another piece of information that had been given to police the day before Margaret and Paul's funeral. Jamie Tonkin, a deer hunter, had been at his uncle's birthday party on the 4th of May. His uncle was also a hunter and a number of other hunters were at the party. Some of the men started talking about the 2 bodies that had been found off Woods Point Road and how the preliminary reports were that the couple had been buried there in the first weekend of April. Tonkin immediately called a friend of his, Craig Lamont. The information he had overheard about the shallow grave had piqued his interest, because on that weekend, he and Lamont just so happened to be camping at the Thompson-Jordan Divide, known as TJ, and it just so happened to be on Woods Point Road. The men had woken early on Saturday the 6th of April and spent a few hours stalking deer wallows, which are marks in the mud usually caused by stags rolling around to mark their territory. They headed back to camp, had some lunch and talked about going fishing, but decided just to go home instead. They were driving back down Woods Point Road when a red Nissan Patrol braked suddenly on a small dirt track on their left. Tonkin took notice of the vehicle because of the trailer it was towing. He thought that maybe the driver had deer in the trailer, and if he'd come from that track, then the deer would have been illegally shot. You had to have permission from the Parks Department to go into the area that the Nissan had come from, and it didn't look like any Parks Department vehicle that Tonkin had ever seen. He remembered that the Nissan looked clean. It was in good condition, unlike most of the four-wheel drives that would usually go through the area. As they passed the vehicle and trailer, Tonkin saw that there weren't deer in it after all. The trailer actually looked empty. It was covered with a blue tarp which was tied down on 3 sides, with the 4th side flapping in the wind. Tonkin and Lamont laughed to themselves. The driver probably freaked out and slammed on his brakes so suddenly, thinking that their white Land Cruiser was a Parks Department vehicle and that they were rangers. Considering the track that the Nissan had been on was not open to the public, he'd probably been scared that he was about to get into trouble. Tonkin had thought no more of this until his uncle's birthday party. The bodies had been found 3 weeks after this, on the same dirt track that the Nissan patrol had been coming out of. Tonkin spoke to Lamont the day after the party, confirming the dates they'd been camping, and the next day he called the police. A few hours after he'd made the call, Homicide Squad detectives Fraser and Van Veenendaal were escorting Tonkin in an unmarked police car to Woods Point Road. Tonkin directed them to where he had seen the Nissan patrol. They got out of the car and walked a little way down the track until Tonkin stopped and told the detectives that he was 100% sure that they were at the spot where he'd seen the vehicle. Tonkin was standing only meters away from where Margaret Wales-King and Paul King had been buried. The evidence against Matthew Wales was mounting, but detectives knew they needed more. What they had was good, but if they charged Matthew with anything at this point, they ran the risk of not securing a conviction. A good defense lawyer would argue that the only thing detectives could prove is that Matthew might have been an accomplice after the fact, and police knew with every instinct they had that Matthew Wales, either alone or with others, had killed his mother and stepfather, and they wanted to make sure he paid for that crime. They would get exactly that, courtesy of the last person they expected, Margaret Wales. See, while police were investigating purchases, evidence, and the fact that the exact same car as Matthew's was seen at the burial site on the weekend that Margaret and Paul went missing, Maritza was talking to her lawyer. Paul Galbally was Maritza's solicitor, and he had gone with her to meet criminal barrister Philip Dunn, QC. Maritza had met with the men 3 times in the 2 weeks before the funeral, meetings that Matthew was unaware of. In the first 2 meetings she hadn't spoken much and only stayed for a few minutes before seeming to get cold feet and leaving. In the 3rd meeting, Dunn asked her to stay. The men had seen the news footage, they knew about the murders, the bodies, and the suspicions that she and her husband had something to do with the deaths of Margaret Wales-King and Paul King. In this 3rd meeting, Maritza finally spoke. She cried as she talked. She started with, quote, "I don't know what to do. Matt is saying that he'll go to the police and sort it out. I don't know. I've been asking him for weeks." Maritza told them what she knew and then left the lawyers to mull over the information she had shared and come up with some sort of strategy. Galbally and Dunn spent hours working on what they were going to do. They knew they needed to contact the Homicide Squad on behalf of their client, and they needed to do it before a confession was made. It was vital to convince police that Maritza was telling the truth about her involvement, and the only way to do that was to give detectives something that they didn't have. Information. They called Homicide and left a message. It was 2 days later detectives and the lawyers finally met in person. Detective Inspector Brian Ricks, head of Homicide, attended the meeting himself. Dunn told him that they could help with the current investigation. Ricks wasn't convinced. He told them that he didn't need any help. But Dunn was determined. He told the detective that their client could give them something that could help, and it would be enough to charge her with an offence. They could charge her and not oppose her bail, and then if they decided that she hadn't been frank with them, they would be able to charge her with something more substantial. Basically, They would give the detectives the information that Maritza had given them, and to convince the detectives that she had told the truth, they gave them the option of charging her with a lesser offence, and would have the opportunity to charge her with something more if they found that she was lying. Dunn then told the detectives what they knew. Matthew Wales had hit his mother and stepfather over the back of the head multiple times. He'd then stacked their bodies up against the inside of the front fence in the dirt. He'd left them there for an entire day, hidden under cloth and the wading pool. There would be bloodstains in the garden to prove this. He had then taken them out to Woods Point Road and buried them. Matthew had come home and collected more dirt and some rocks from the garden to help cover the shallow grave where he'd left their bodies. On the 10th of May, the solicitors drafted a 10-page can-say statement, got Maritza to sign it, and sent a copy to the homicide squad. A can-say or will-say statement is simply a summary of evidence that a witness could provide in court if required. The statement itself cannot be used as evidence against an accused person, but it gave investigators an overview of what Maritza Wales could testify to if she was asked to take the stand against her husband. When detectives received the statement, they organised a meeting with Maritza Wales, and early on the morning of May the 11th, she had a recorded interview with them, where she told them everything she knew about what had happened on the night of the 4th of April and the actions of Matthew since then. Detectives finally had what they needed. As Matthew left his house that morning in the very same red Nissan Patrol that Tonkin and Lamont had seen in the dirt track, Detectives Nazarian and Waddell came up behind him in their unmarked car. They flashed their lights and watched as Matthew looked at them through his rearview mirror and pulled the car over. The detectives got out and approached his vehicle and arrested him for the murders. He was taken to the largest police station in Melbourne, the St Kilda Road Police Complex, and put into a locked interview room. He was read his rights and told that he was under no obligation to say anything if he didn't want to. Matthew said he understood and asked to speak with his own lawyer, Steve Peaker. He spoke to his lawyer for just over an hour, and then the interview resumed. Waddell asked Matthew what had really happened on the night of the 4th of April. Matthew had been expecting to be caught since that same night, and so he decided it was better to just tell them what they needed to know. On the afternoon of the 4th of April, Matthew had been preparing dinner. He was expecting his wife to be home before 6 p.m. and his mother and stepfather an hour or so later. He prepared a vegetable risotto. While it was cooking, he ground up a large handful of paracetamol and codeine tablets and his mother-in-law's blood pressure tablets and hid the powder in the cupboard above the stove. Then he went back to the meal he was cooking. He heard his son Dominic wake up from his nap, and Matthew brought him downstairs. He sat his son down in the spare bedroom that had slowly turned into a storage room for all of Dominic's toys. Watching his son play, he thought of his own childhood. He had a list in his head that he ran through at times like this, a list of all the things that his mother had done to hurt him over the years. The manipulations, the control of money, interfering in his personal life, the criticisms she had made of both him and his Chilean-born wife, who she seemed to have no respect for. The mind games that she played with him, the way she had kept him from his siblings when they were younger, letting them see their biological father as they pleased but keeping Matthew from him. He thought of his hatred of how she treated him like he was an idiot, a dumb child instead of a grown man. Matthew was the baby of the family and felt like his siblings didn't like him, and he felt distanced from them. His brother Damien would later say that he didn't really get along with his brother. He thought Matthew was reckless and irresponsible, who lied constantly and was often cruel to animals. Matthew had not done well at school at all and had been diagnosed with learning difficulties at an early age. After leaving school at 17, Margaret continued to assist her youngest child in any way she could and secured him his first job at a hardware store. But it only took 4 months before he was let go. He decided that he wanted to study hairdressing and attended the John Moray School and managed to complete the 20-month course to become qualified. Although Matthew's sisters had the distinct impression that his mother had paid off the academy to allow Matthew to receive his qualification. Matthew denies this, but his siblings all agree that he received more attention, financial support, and special treatment from their mother. He managed to get a job in John Moray's salon, but left after a year for a position in another upmarket salon owned by Peter Sango. Matthew didn't seem to be progressing well at all, and it was rumoured that his mother actually arranged with Sango to pay his wages herself, just so he would keep Matthew on as a stylist. Either way, after a year he moved again and spent a year working at Karl of Switzerland. It seemed like 1 year was his limit, and after a year there, he went off to work for Tony Latouf. He finally seemed settled and worked there for 5 years before subleasing the back half of the shop, where he did relatively well. His siblings had become wary of their brother. They thought he was cunning and secretive and used the fact that their mother paid more attention to him against them. Matthew met Maritza Pizarro when she came in to get her hair done for an upcoming blind date. They got to know each other and their relationship grew from stylist and client to lovers, and they were married only a year later. Matthew's family weren't the warmest towards his new bride. They thought that Maritza put on a good show in front of their parents, but behind closed doors she was harsh, demanding, and controlling of Matthew. Emma said that not long after the two had been married, Maritza started to criticize her new mother-in-law and would regularly complain that Margaret should be more generous with her money. In March of the year 2000, Matthew and Maritza had their son Dominic, and when he was a few months old, they decided to upgrade their home. The Horace Street house was sold, and Margaret, who had paid $150,000 towards it and taken the loan for the rest, was paid back her investment. The profit was over $140,000, and Matthew wanted all of it. Margaret was hesitant. Her youngest had never been great with money, and she didn't want him wasting it, and so told him that he should invest at least half of it towards a new house. He did not want to do this, and so Margaret withheld half the money. In late 2000, Matthew developed RSI in his hand and had to close his shop, stop working, and started receiving disability payments. He and Maritza wanted to open a shop together, but they needed money to do so. After many arguments and discussions with his mother and her lawyer, Margaret finally agreed to release the remaining profit from the sale of Matthew's house. He and Maritza found a shop on High Street and went to Hong Kong for stock. Once they'd fitted out the location in June 2001, Maritza's Imports was open for business. Margaret had been right to be concerned about this purchase. Neither Matthew or Maritza had any experience running a retail business, and within months the shop was trading at a loss, and the couple had put it up for sale. By the time Margaret and Paul had come around for dinner on the 4th of April 2002, Matthew's resentment of his mother was at an all-time high. He said he'd thought about killing her many times before dinner that night, but this time he was about to go through with it. He was especially bitter about something that had happened earlier that year. His grandfather, Rob Lord, had owned an apartment on the Gold Coast in Queensland, and when he died, he stated in his will that the rental income and any profits from sale was to be paid into 2 trusts, one for each of his daughters and their children. The terms of the will stated that his grandchildren would only have access to that income after taking into consideration the needs of Margaret and Di. For a long time, Di had wanted to sell the unit and wind up her trust so that the proceeds of the sale could be paid to her 3 children. Margaret, on the other hand, did not want to do the same. She didn't want her children to have control of that money. After months of debate, it was decided that the unit would be sold privately, which was not approved under the terms of the trust. And so all the trustees needed all the beneficiaries to sign an indemnity to protect them from any legal action by selling this way. In December of 2001, Margaret, her daughters, Matthew, and her solicitor met to discuss the sale. The Wales children wanted to know all of the particulars of their grandfather's will in relation to the unit and what Margaret intended to do with the proceeds of the sale. The girls and Matthew felt like their mother was sufficiently taken care of and didn't need the additional profit, but Margaret told her children in this meeting that she intended to set up a new trust with herself as the only beneficiary until her death, and then the children would inherit any remaining money. Margaret's children were not okay with this arrangement. They knew that their names were on the current trust as beneficiaries, and they wanted to make sure that they were involved in the sale and where the money went. Margaret didn't like that at all. She became very angry and told the 4 of her children that that was just never going to happen. Matthew was not the only one to be frustrated and angry about what their mother was trying to do. Prudence and Sally also felt like their mother was being unreasonable. Sally later said that she felt relieved when they left the solicitor's office without signing anything. Quote, "To be honest, we were pleased that we hadn't been railroaded into something we didn't fully understand, because Mum wanted us to sign those papers no matter what, and we felt like we were being treated like children who didn't understand what was going on." It was a few days later that Margaret's solicitor contacted the children, telling them that Margaret had decided to keep the estate income as it was with the trustee company. Eventually, on that basis, all 5 of the Wales children signed the indemnity, allowing the sale to go ahead. But Margaret had refused to speak with any of them for up to a month after the disagreement. It was this kind of control and manipulation that had incensed Matthew for most of his life. After Matthew had finished prepping the risotto, he went outside. He had a pile of wood that he had brought with him when he had moved from his previous address. He picked up a piece of it and took it inside. He hid it in the broom cupboard in the kitchen, but changed his mind. It didn't feel right, and he wouldn't be able to get to it without alerting his wife. He took it back outside and hid it behind the hedges that grew on both sides of his front door. Maritza arrived home at 5:30 p.m. and played with Dominic while Matthew went back to finish dinner. Just before 7 p.m, Matthew heard his mother's car pull into the driveway. He went out to meet her and Paul, plastering a smile on his face. Maritza poured the couple some wine while Matthew went to serve dinner. In Margaret and Paul's bowls, he also added the powder that he had prepared earlier. He said that he didn't want them to go through any pain and just wanted to slow them down a little, decrease their reaction time. Over dinner, they talked about the little things. He hadn't lied in that first statement about the conversations that they'd had. The children, the garden, using the American Express card for the points, taking Dominic to see his cousins. After dinner, they moved into the lounge room and drank some more wine. He noticed his mother starting to slur her words slightly. Paul just sat quietly in the chair next to her. At 9:30 p.m, Dominic became restless and Maritza decided to take him to bed. She let him kiss his grandparents goodnight and she took him upstairs. Margaret picked up her bag and helped her husband out of his chair. They walked outside, Matthew trailing them. As they walked towards the car, Matthew turned off the front light, and he then felt around the hedges for the heavy piece of wood that he'd stashed earlier. He lifted it above his head with both hands and brought it down on the back of his mother's head. She crumpled to the ground without making a sound. Paul didn't seem to have heard anything, and Matthew stepped towards him, raising the wood again, and brought it down on Paul in the same place, the back of the head and neck. Paul fell to the ground, face first into the concrete paving stones. Matthew hit each of them with the wood again and again. He used more force with every hit. He furiously continued to attack the both of them, beating the back of their heads until blood started to cover the ground. He stopped then and knelt down next to his mother. bleeding and lifeless in his front yard. He couldn't hear her breathing, couldn't find a pulse. He leant over his stepfather's body. He was still face down in a puddle of blood. Again, he felt no pulse, and was satisfied that he had killed both of them. He started to pace the front garden. He thought he would feel scared and anxious about what he had done, but he didn't. He felt relieved. He felt free. His entire life he felt like his mother had treated him badly, not showing physical affection, never letting him be himself, never letting him grow up. He let the relief he felt wash over him as he stared at the bodies. But then he noticed a flicker of light in the window above a shop opposite his home. A woman was standing in the window, looking straight at him, and she was talking on the phone. Could she see him? Was she calling the police? He didn't know, and at that point he didn't care. If he was caught, he was caught. At least he'd finally done it. He'd finally got rid of the person that he thought had always been trying to ruin his life. He sat down on the front step for a minute, relishing in the feeling that all of his pain was now gone, and then he went inside to find his wife. But he didn't need to look far. Maritza had come out when she had noticed that the lounge was empty, the front door was open, but the front light was off. She saw their dinner guests lying in a bloody heap on the pavement. She took one step closer but couldn't believe what she was looking at. Matthew ran towards her and ordered her to go back inside. She asked what had happened, and Matthew told her that he had hit them. Matthew pushed his wife inside the house. He followed her and shut the front door. He was sweating profusely and shaking, and there was blood on his clothes. Maritza felt sick. She ran upstairs and vomited, knowing her life as she knew it was about to change drastically. Matthew came into the bathroom and tried to comfort his wife, but she pushed him away. She didn't want to look at him. Matthew said that he had hit them, that he had had to do it, that it was a relief that he'd had him in it to actually do it. Maritza still couldn't bear to look at the man she thought she knew. She asked him what he was going to do. Matthew told her that he would fix it, and left her in the upstairs bedroom. He went down to the kitchen and grabbed a pair of latex gloves, put them on, and went back outside. He dragged his mother by her feet to the grass behind their high brick fence and turned her over so she lay face up. He went back to Paul and grabbed him underneath the armpits and dragged him to the same spot. He went into the garage and picked up his son's blue wading pool, which he placed on top of the bodies. He went back upstairs and told Maritza that he needed to take care of the car. He got in the Mercedes and drove it to where it was found a week later and paid cash for a taxi home. He and his wife didn't get any sleep that night. They stayed up talking about what had happened. Maritza was panicking and begging him to call the police, but Matthew pleaded with her to give him more time. He knew that eventually he would probably be caught, but told her that he felt freer than he ever had because they were gone. He told her he just wanted more time with her and their son, but that he would fix it eventually. All night he imagined hearing noises outside, and he frequently went to check on the bodies of his mother and stepfather, still lying underneath the plastic pool in the front yard. When the sun rose the next morning, he went down to the bodies with a green sheet that he'd grabbed from the linen cupboard. Under the pool, his mother and stepfather's faces looked up at him, and he didn't want to see them. So he ripped the sheet in half and wrapped a piece over each of their faces, securing it with a knot under the chin. He dragged the pool back over them. At 7 a.m. he drove to an ATM and withdrew some cash. He went down to the local petrol station and hired the box trailer using his real name and previous address on the hire form. He took the trailer home and pushed it onto the lawn. He couldn't move the bodies yet because Dominic had woken up and was watching his dad through the window. Matthew went inside to make breakfast. Maritza was still a mess. She was still crying and refused to let her husband touch her. Matthew told her to go to work as normal and that he would go to the police once he'd had some more time with her and Dom. Before Maritza left for work, Matthew went back out and bought the sash cord, steel chain, and 5 more D-shackles from the hardware store. He then popped in across the road to a brick company and asked them if he could buy some concrete bricks that he needed to build a feature in a fireplace. The storeman told him that concrete bricks wouldn't work, a fireplace would be too hot for them and they would shatter, and said that he should be buying pressed clay bricks. Matthew got angry and told the man that he knew exactly what he wanted, and ended up taking 3 large concrete Besser bricks from a pile left over from a display. He went home, and after Maritza left for work, he kept Dominic amused inside for a couple of hours. Dom went down for a nap, and Matthew got to work. He grabbed another pair of gloves and 2 quilt covers from the cupboard. He went outside, pulled the pull off the bodies and proceeded to put them inside the quilt covers. He wrapped the sash cord around the covered bodies of his mother and stepfather, and then added the chain around Paul's body. He then threaded more chain through the 3 large Besser bricks and connected them with the shackles. He called his wife at work to see if she was okay and also to ask her to come home because, he was just starting to get really emotional about the whole thing. Matthew went back outside and dragged the covered bodies into the floor of the trailer. He then put the pull back over them and added some old paint tins and a sawhorse on top of that to make it look like he was just hauling some old rubbish. He pulled the blue tarp over the trailer and tied it down before heading back inside the house to wake up his son. Maritza came home early and Matthew warned her not to go into the garage, telling her that he still had them in the trailer. Maritza cried again that night and begged her husband to go to the police. He told Maritza again and again that all he wanted was some more time with her and Dom before the police would eventually catch him. He was surprised they hadn't already done so. Maybe the woman in the window hadn't seen him kill them after all. The next morning, Saturday the 6th of April, Maritza took Dominic with her to work and Matthew headed out to finish what he'd started. He went down to another hardware store and purchased a mattock and a large bottle of liquid magnet, an industrial cleaner. He stopped in at Fulton Garden Supplies where he ordered 1/2 metre of Shawcrop compost to be delivered on Monday the 8th of April. At lunchtime, Matthew went and collected his wife and son from her store. She hadn't been feeling well and needed to come home. She started vomiting again when they got back, and Matthew put Dominic to bed. At 12:38 p.m, Matthew called his mother's house, knowing the machine would pick up. He left a message asking about his wife's new migraine medication. He wanted to make sure that he was one of the voices on Margaret's answering machine. It would look better. He hitched the trailer to the Nissan Patrol and after stopping for fuel, he drove out through the eastern suburbs. He had placed his mother's keys, handbag, cardigan, hers and Paul's shoes, his blood-stained clothing and some of her jewellery into black rubbish bags, and he snapped her mobile phone in half. He stopped at another fuel station and picked up a map. He didn't know where he was going, but he thought it would be a good idea to head towards the forest. He drove for about 3 hours and took a few wrong turns, but eventually came upon a dirt track that headed into the depths of the Yarra National Park. He drove down the track some way and came across an area that was free of trees. He got the mattock out and started to dig. The dirt gave way easily and he'd soon dug a shallow grave deep enough to bury his 2 victims. He pushed his mother and then Paul into the grave, placed Dominic's pool back over them and dropped in the bricks connected by the chain. He filled the hole as best he could and compacted the soil down with his feet. As he drove out of the dirt track, a white 4-wheel drive came towards him. Matthew hadn't seen or heard anyone since he'd been there, and the appearance of what could be a ranger's vehicle scared him. He slammed on his brakes and pulled his cap lower to cover his face. He stopped periodically to throw out the rubbish bags of his mother's and Paul's belongings, and he went home. The next day he loaded up some of the dirt and grass from his yard into the trailer and went back out to the grave. He wanted to cover it with more dirt, just in case wild animals got to it. On Monday morning, the compost was delivered to the house, and Matthew used it to cover the missing dirt and grass on the lawn and to cover any bloodstains that might still be on the grass. Later that afternoon, he got a call from his sister asking if his mother and stepfather had been there for dinner on Thursday. In Matthew's interrogation, he answered a total of 1,467 questions. Towards the end of the questioning, he was asked to clarify his motive, and he said that it wasn't just money, but that he felt like they had alienated him from the rest of his family, and he needed to destroy their lives because they had destroyed his. When he asked why he killed Paul as well, Matthew said that he actually quite liked Paul, but at the same time, it was Paul that had caused his mother and father to divorce. He also confirmed that Maritza had nothing to do with anything that had happened that night. Matthew was taken to the magistrate's court where he was refused bail and remanded in custody. Maritza was also at the police station. Her version of the evening and following days was similar to Matthew's. She had seen the bodies, she had begged Matthew to go to the police, she had cried for days, and she hadn't been able to look at her sisters-in-law in the eyes ever since. She was asked why she didn't go to the police herself, and she said that she'd been thinking of her son, thinking of Dominic and Matthew. She had given a false statement because she was scared of losing them. Based on the false statement she had initially made and the fact that she knew about the murders the entire time and had told no one, she was charged with 2 counts of accessory to murder, and she was released on bail. Meanwhile, police were digging up Matthew and Maritza's front yard. The committal hearing for the husband and wife was set for the 17th of October 2002. Since being remanded, Matthew had regularly seen a forensic psychologist, Ian Joblin. Joblin's first impression of Matthew that he was, quote, not right. He couldn't put a finger on what was wrong, and there was no diagnosis that fit in the DSM, or Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. He administered multiple psychological tests and determined that not only did Matthew have an IQ of 83, which meant his intelligence was limited and he had an underdeveloped abstract reasoning, but he was also most likely dyslexic, which explained his performance at school. He also claimed that his family hated his wife, looked down on her, and didn't treat her with the respect that she deserved. One of the things they spoke about at length was Matthew's reasoning for choosing that day to kill his mother and stepfather. Matthew told him something that he'd never said to his family or his wife or police. He'd thought many times about killing his mother and Paul, but had never acted on it. On the night that they had come for dinner, when he went to let Paul know that the meal was ready, he walked into his son's playroom and says that he saw Paul's hand down the front of Dominic's nappy, and he had a flashback of the man doing the same thing to him. He said that when he was 8 or 9 years old, he would be made to visit with his stepfather on the farm instead of being allowed to go and see his father with his brother and sisters. He claimed that Paul King would fondle his genitals during these visits, but after about 3 years of this, he summoned the courage to tell him to stop touching him, and the abuse stopped. When he walked in and saw his stepfather doing the same thing to his son, it was the final straw, and he decided then and there that he would kill them. Now, I'm not by any means saying that this abuse did or didn't happen, but not once in Matthew's life had he ever mentioned it to anyone, not his family, not a therapist that he'd seen as a teenager, not his wife, and he had certainly never mentioned it in any of his police interviews. The other thing to consider is that even though he says he decided to actually kill them after seeing this, he'd already prepared the drugs in the kitchen and he'd already stashed the murder weapon in a convenient location. He had planned out these murders before he says he'd seen Paul with his son. None of his family believed that he was abused physically or sexually and claimed that he spent months in custody trying to come up with a believable reason that he snapped that night. In fact, throughout his life and in his police interviews, he'd maintained that he really, really liked Paul and that they'd gotten along extremely well. The other thing that Matthew spoke about with his psychologist was his surprise at his siblings' reactions to the murders. He assumed that his brother and sisters would be just as relieved as he was that their mother was dead. None of his siblings came to visit him in the 7 months that he was in custody, and Prue even sent him a letter telling him how disgusted and angry they were with him. Matthew was astounded at this. He actually thought that he was doing them all a favour. A month before the committal hearing in September of that year, Maritza learnt that her charges would be downgraded to perverting the course of justice for providing a false statement to police. Investigators were satisfied that she had no prior knowledge of Matthew's plans and that she did not assist him whatsoever in the murders or the attempt to hide the bodies. The Wales family were furious and thought that she should be held accountable for what she did, or rather didn't do. But there was a provision in the Crimes Act which prevented a married person from being charged as an accessory to a serious crime if all they'd done was comfort their spouse after he or she had committed a crime. Damien, Sally, Emma and Prue were livid. The fact was that Margaret and Paul's autopsies had proven that the blunt force trauma was not enough to have killed them. They'd both asphyxiated. And there were signs of strangulation, which Matthew had never addressed. He'd been adamant that he had not strangled them, but the evidence showed that they were still alive after he'd struck them both with the wood block, which to the rest of the family meant that if Maritza had called the police when she had seen what Matthew had done, then they might still be alive, which deserved more than just perverting the course of justice. While the details of the crimes were being highly publicised, the rest of the Wales children were defending their mother and her husband. They said that Matthew had done serious damage to their mother's name, that he was lying about their mother being manipulative, and that they were absolutely disgusted with him. Matthew and Maritza both informed the magistrate through their lawyers that they both intended to plead guilty, which meant that they didn't actually need to go through a committal hearing. Their plea hearing began on the 18th of December. Matthew pled guilty to 2 counts of murder and Maritza pled guilty to perverting the course of justice. Matthew's defense team told the story of how Matthew had always felt like his mother was controlling, manipulative, and domineering, and how he had developed an obsession with getting her out of his life. Matthew's lawyer went on to repeat his claims of sexual assault at the hands of Paul King and how it formed a part of the motivation behind the murders, but interestingly did not mention the fact that Matthew had walked in and seen Paul with Dominic. The judge, Justice Coldry, closed the court at 4:40 p.m. and it reconvened at 10:30 the following morning. It was now Maritza's turn to be in the spotlight. Philip Dunn told the court that yes, Maritza had done the wrong thing, but that she had been motivated by the intense desire to keep her family together, that she had begged Matthew on multiple occasions to go to the police, that she knew absolutely nothing about Matthew's plan until he had already acted on it. He pointed to her plea of guilty, her previous good character, and the fact that before Matthew had confessed, it was her that had gone and made a statement to police, that she had eventually done the right thing. He asked the judge to consider that her son would be 3 in a few months, and that with Matthew pleading guilty, Dominic had already lost one parent. He continued by telling the court that the little boy needed his mother, and that they sought a suspended sentence. Giving her false statement was inexcusable, but, in a certain light, it was understandable. Matthew was taken back to prison and Maritza was allowed to go home as long as she reported in regularly to the police station, and they waited for their sentencing hearing. It wouldn't be till the 11th of April 2003, 1 year and 1 week to the day that Matthew had killed Margaret and Paul, that they would finally be sentenced. The Wales family, their spouses, and many extended members of both Margaret and Paul's families filed into the courtroom to see whether justice would be served. Justice Coldry outlined the aggravating and mitigating factors of the crimes. He said to Matthew that the aggravating factors were that the victims were elderly and vulnerable, the murders were clearly premeditated, he had gone to extensive means to cover them up, that his conduct after the murders caused incredible anguish to his family, and that he showed zero remorse and in fact had actually felt relief and happiness after the fact. As for the mitigating factors, they included that Matthew had a very low IQ and was unable to control his obsession. He had no prior convictions, had a good employment record, was proven to be a good father and husband, and he had good prospects of rehabilitation. The judge also said that he was no real threat to the community as his obsession had solely revolved around his mother and stepfather. In my humble opinion, anyone who murders anyone for almost any reason represents some sort of danger, but that's just me. As for Maritza, he was satisfied that she had not played any part in killing Margaret or Paul, and that her husband had placed her in an extraordinary situation. She had faced a conflict between what was legally correct and what her husband wanted. She had been slandered in the media for over a year and was also dealing with psychological effects from the incident. She had come forward eventually, and she seemed to have shown real remorse for her actions. He also took into consideration that by going to the police, she knew that she was ending her marriage and putting the man she loved in prison. Maritza Wales received a sentence of 2 years, suspended. She would never see the inside of a prison. If she reoffended, she would serve the 2 years inside a correctional facility, but for now she was free to go home and take care of her son. Justice Coldry turned to Matthew Wales. Quote, "I sentence you on count 1 for the murder of Margaret Wales-King to 20 years imprisonment, and on count 2 for the murder of Paul King to 20 years imprisonment." 10 years of Matthew's sentence for count 2 would run concurrently to the sentence for count 1, which made his total sentence 30 years, with parole eligibility after 24 years. He will be eligible for parole in 2026. Damien Wales said as he left the courtroom, quote, "This whole case has been dictated by what my brother and sister-in-law have had to say. There is more to it." The family maintains that the full truth of the murders was never uncovered. There were many inconsistencies, including the fact that only Margaret's body showed any evidence of having ingested the blood pressure tablets that Matthew said he'd given both of them. The evidence of strangulation on both bodies that was never explained. That the victims might very well be alive if someone, namely Maritza Wales, had called the police. Victoria Police said that as far as they were concerned, the case was over, the investigation was concluded, and the matter was solved. The Wales-King Society murders became one of the most highly publicised cases in Australia. There were Wales-King walking tours of the Mercer Road house, the Burke Street address, the track that became their initial burial site, and it even included the petrol stations that Matthew had visited. There have been Wales-King murder-themed dinner parties, and the public seemed to grasp at any and all mention of the crimes reported in the media. And why were these murders given more airtime, more coverage, and more attention than others? Well, that really came down to 2 reasons. Firstly, because Margaret Wales-King was a rich socialite who was well known to the community, and because there had been no ransom, it was instantly a mystery as to where her and her husband could have disappeared to. And secondly, because cases of matricide are extremely rare. To murder anyone is unthinkable to most people, but to kill the person who gave you life goes against the very nature of human behaviour. And the case as it unfolded not only disgusted but also intrigued not just the state of Victoria, but the entire country. And that, my friends, is the case of the Wales-King Society murders. I will be back with more Australian true crime, but until then, be good, be safe, and don't murder anyone. Bye.